He's gone. That's what Rob Reiner allegedly whispered to the 911 operator. Her voice barely audible, breath shallow, words clipped by shock. But it wasn't a stranger she was reporting. It wasn't a break-in. It wasn't a robbery. It was her own brother. And it wasn't just "he's gone" that shattered the air that morning in Brentwood. It was who was gone. Her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, Hollywood royalty, beloved icons, found side by side, stabbed, drained of life in their $13.5 million estate. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. How does a family go from red carpets to red tape at a crime scene? How does a father who made America laugh become the center of a case that's left America speechless? And why, after weeks of silence, confusion, and rumors, did their son Nick Reiner, age 32, finally plead guilty to both murders? With a chilling line that no one in the courtroom will ever forget, this wasn't just a confession. It was a reckoning. And yet, what Nick admitted still doesn't explain everything. Not fully. Because if you look closely, there were warnings, patterns, desperate cries for help, and buried truths that might explain why Brentwood PD didn't just find bodies that day. They found a secret. One that went deeper than blood. One that started long before Sunday, December 14th. And one that may not end with Nick's guilty plea. So here's the question we all need to ask. Was this murder born out of madness, or something far more calculated? Let's rewind. It was just before 9 a.m. on that cool December morning when Rob Reiner reportedly arrived at her parents' home to deliver holiday decorations. A last-minute tradition. A daughter popping in, nothing unusual, except what she walked into was a home frozen in silence. No coffee brewing, no music playing, no laughter echoing from the living room, where Rob would usually be quoting lines from The Princess Bride or debating politics with one of his Twitter followers on speakerphone. Instead, nothing, until she saw the blood. Blood on the marble tiles. Blood leading to the kitchen. Blood smeared across the white paneled door that led to her father's study. That's when she called 911. And that's when the myth of the perfect Hollywood family collapsed. Because to the outside world, Rob Reiner was the dream. Son of Carl Reiner. Husband to Michelle Singer. Award-winning director. Actor. Political activist. Devoted dad. And Nick? Well, Nick was the redemption arc. The comeback kid. The troubled teen who turned his pain into purpose by co-writing Being Charlie, a film inspired by his time in rehab. Rob produced it. Critics called it raw and real. Everyone thought the Reiners were healing. But here's the truth. Appearances deceive. Because sources now suggest Nick wasn't living independently in Los Feliz or downtown LA like fans believed. He was in the guest house, on the property, living feet away from the parents he would later admit to stabbing. Why? That's the question prosecutors still don't have a full answer for. And that Nick's own confession only complicated. Because according to transcripts leaked from his plea hearing, Nick didn't just plead guilty. He said, "They weren't who you thought they were." What did he mean? Let's pause and ask you directly. Have you ever wondered what it's like to grow up in a house where everything looks perfect on the outside, but inside, something's rotting? Have you ever seen someone smile in public while falling apart behind closed doors? That's what this case is. It's not just a true crime story. It's a portrait of fame, fragility, and the lies we're too scared to confront. And Romy, the youngest, the one who made the call, she may have known more than she's let on. Reports say she told police, "There's a family member I've always been afraid of. I don't know what happened, but if something happened, it was him." Let that sink in. Not a maybe, not a guess, a declaration, a warning. And yet, somehow, that warning came too late. Because by the time officers arrived, Rob and Michelle were already gone. And Nick? Nick was waiting, sitting on the guest house steps, barefoot, silent, blood on his sleeves. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply asked, did she find them? What happened between these walls? What tore this family apart? That's what we're going to uncover. Because this story isn't just about that morning. It's about everything that led to it. From Nick's troubled youth and addiction battles, to private therapy sessions, estranged siblings, financial motives, mental health reports, and Romy's final cryptic social media post. You're going to hear about a missing diary, a deleted voicemail, a surveillance tape the family never knew existed. You're going to hear about Jake Reiner, Nick's half-brother, who may have known something but disappeared for days. And you're going to see how Hollywood's illusion of perfection can hide a nightmare no camera ever caught. Because when the coroner's report listed the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries and the manner of death as homicide, that wasn't the full picture. It was the aftermath. But the real story? It started long before December 14th. It started with whispers, with secrets, with a family unraveling one quiet argument at a time. Now, a warning. What you're about to hear in the coming chapters will disturb you. You'll question who the real victim is. You'll wonder what role mental illness played. And you'll ask yourself the same thing detectives asked when they opened that guest house door. Why didn't anyone stop this? In the next chapter, we'll take you inside the crime scene. The chilling details of what Romy saw and why Brentwood PD knew immediately that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. But what they found next in the guest house, that changed everything. And no one saw it coming. Why didn't he run? That's what stunned the officers first. Not the bodies, not the blood, not even the slashed white curtains fluttering in the kitchen breeze like nothing had happened. But him, sitting there, calm, silent, on the steps of the guest house like he was waiting for a taxi. They said his hands were folded in his lap, that he was barefoot, that he looked relieved. But what did Nick Reiner have to be relieved about? Moments earlier, police officers had entered the Brentwood estate of one of Hollywood's most cherished icons and walked into a living nightmare. Rob Reiner, 78. Michelle Singer Reiner, 70. Both dead, multiple stab wounds. The couple lay near the kitchen island, side by side, his left hand still reaching for her. Her mouth open, frozen in a final scream. The kitchen was painted in blood. What could have possibly led to this? What darkness had crept into that beautiful, sun-drenched mansion? And more importantly, what exactly did Romy see that morning when she opened the front door? Because if you believe the police logs, her voice told them everything they needed to know. Romy Reiner had always been the quiet one, the artist, the observer, the one who stayed out of the tabloid headlines. But on that December morning, she became something else entirely, a witness, a daughter who walked into horror, a sister who might have known more than she ever let on. Let's reconstruct the timeline. It was Sunday, December 14th, just past 8:30 a.m. Romy had texted her mom earlier that morning, bringing the vintage wreaths over. Dad'll love the bells, LOL. No response. But that wasn't weird. Michelle had a habit of leaving her phone in odd places. Romy pulled into the long driveway. The gate was open. Again, nothing suspicious. Sometimes Rob left it that way for deliveries. She walked up to the door. No barking from the dogs. No voices. No jazz playing on the Bluetooth speaker. She used her spare key. And then she saw it. A red trail. Faint at first. Like someone had spilled wine. But the droplets led to the kitchen. And the droplets became smears. And the smears became handprints. She screamed. And then, according to official transcripts from the 911 call obtained by a local outlet, she said, "My parents. I think they're dead. There's blood everywhere. I think it was Nick." Just like that. No hesitation. I think it was Nick. So the police arrived. Guns drawn. Sirens off. They were told the suspect might still be on the property. And that's when they found him. Sitting. Waiting. Staring out at the backyard. As if watching something only he could see. He didn't speak at first. And then he whispered, "I didn't mean to hurt them." But they knew this was coming. That line sent chills down the spine of even the most seasoned detectives. What did he mean by they knew this was coming? Was this premeditated? Was it a psychotic break? Or something else? Let's take a step back. Let's talk about the house. This wasn't just any Brentwood home. It was a $13.5 million estate, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows, an infinity pool, a library of film scripts, and walls lined with Emmy and Oscar memorabilia. A fortress of success. A shrine to legacy. And yet, on that morning, it became the setting of one of the most shocking family tragedies Los Angeles had seen in years. Crime scene investigators said the level of violence was personal. The wounds were not clean, not quick, not random. They were targeted. There were signs of a struggle. Broken dishes. A toppled chair. Michelle's fingernails cracked, as if she had fought back with everything she had. One officer reportedly muttered to his partner, "This wasn't rage. This was punishment." But punishment for what? That's the question everyone from the LAPD to the press to the Reiner family's inner circle has been asking. Because if this were simply a case of a mental breakdown, or a drug-induced frenzy, or even financial dispute, it still wouldn't explain what came next. After Nick was taken into custody, still silent, still eerily calm, officers began their sweep of the property. And that's when they moved toward the guest house. At first glance, it was tidy. Books stacked on the desk. A laptop left open. A record player still spinning side A of a Pink Floyd album. But it was what they found in the bathroom trash that changed the direction of the case. A bloodied sweatshirt, 2 latex gloves, and a handwritten note. The note was partially torn, written in black marker, and read, "They never loved me. They tolerated me. They covered up what happened. They lied to everyone. Now the truth is out. I'm not sorry." Investigators believe the note may have been intended as a manifesto, or perhaps a failed suicide letter, maybe even a psychological game. But either way, it revealed one thing. This wasn't random. This was personal, planned, and very, very dark. But let's return to that earlier question. The one you're probably still turning over in your mind. Why didn't he run? Think about it. He had time. Romy didn't arrive until 8:30. The coroner would later state that the time of death was estimated between 4 o'clock and 6 a.m. That's a 2 to 4 hour window. Enough time to flee, to change, to cover tracks, to drive away, disappear. But he stayed. Some believe it was guilt. Others believe it was delusion. But one theory, raised by a former LAPD profiler, suggests something even more chilling. I think he wanted to be caught. I think this was a final performance. A warped, broken way of being seen, finally, for who he really was. Does that sound like a murderer? Or a son crying out from a lifelong void? Maybe both. Maybe neither. But this is just the beginning. Because what came next, what detectives uncovered in Nick's phone and in the family's digital archives, would shake the foundation of everything people thought they knew about the Reiners. Because beneath the glossy Instagram photos, the awards show smiles, the touching father-son anecdotes, there was a darkness, a secret, and someone tried to warn them all. But the truth? The truth was ignored. And the cost was blood. Why didn't anyone believe me? Those 5 words, allegedly whispered by Nick Reiner during his first recorded police interview, sent a jolt through the room. He didn't open with "I'm sorry." He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't even ask about his sister. Just that chilling, fragile line. Why didn't anyone believe me? Believe what? That's the question investigators struggled to answer in the hours following his arrest. Because Nick wasn't ranting. He wasn't screaming or laughing or confessing in a manic haze. He was still, almost too still. And what he said next, it didn't just complicate things. It cracked the case wide open. Let's rewind to the first 30 minutes of the interview. Detectives Cruz and Halvorsen from LAPD Homicide sat across from Nick in a quiet, windowless room. He wasn't cuffed. They offered him water. He declined. He stared at the floor, unmoving. When Cruz gently asked if he knew why he was there, Nick reportedly replied, "You already know. So why ask?" That's not the response of someone pleading innocence. That's the response of someone resigned. Resigned to consequences. Or maybe welcoming them. Halvorsen leaned in and asked, "Nick, we need to understand what happened. Did anyone else come into that house?" Nick shook his head. One word. No. Then silence. For 6 full minutes, the audio was dead air. The detectives waited. Let the pressure build. And then, Nick broke. Not with a scream. Not with a violent outburst. But a whisper. "I did it. I had to." Now pause. Let that sink in. This wasn't some coerced admission. No yelling. No threats. No legal tricks. He volunteered it. "I did it." So why did that not bring closure? Because what followed made things infinitely more disturbing. When asked why he had to do it, Nick stared at the wall and said, "They lied. They buried it. They made me into something I wasn't." Detectives pressed him. What did they lie about? What did they bury? Nick didn't answer. He just repeated, "They made me." This is where the contradictions begin. Nick's confession wasn't clean. It wasn't linear. It was fragmented, broken, almost scripted. As if he were telling a story he'd told himself 1,000 times before. A story in which he was the victim. And his parents? The villains. Let's talk about the guest house for a moment. This wasn't some cramped garage unit or pool house. It was a fully furnished 2-bedroom guest suite, custom-built on the Reiners' property in 2020. Initially meant for visiting relatives or creative retreats. but it became Nick's home after his 5th stint in rehab. According to a source close to the family, it was Rob's idea, a way to keep Nick close but independent. But others saw it differently. It was exile, said one family acquaintance. They didn't want him alone, but they didn't want him inside, either. Nick lived just 30 feet away from the main house, close enough to hear the laughter from family dinners, close enough to see the lights in his parents' kitchen, but never invited in. Can you imagine that? Being so near, yet never really part of it? Is that what made him snap? Or was there something darker Nick alluded to in that interview? Because after admitting to the killings, he reportedly said, "They told me to forget, but I remembered everything." What did he remember? That's what detectives couldn't get him to say. Was it a family trauma? Abuse? A secret from childhood? No one knows. Because Nick clammed up. He never elaborated. But it gets stranger. Because before he requested an attorney and the interview was paused, Nick said, "Did Romy see them first? Or did she hear me?" A bizarre question. Almost curious. Detached. Like a boy asking if his sister found the cookies he left out. Not a man who'd just confessed to murder. Halvorsen asked, "What do you mean by did she hear me?" Nick looked up and said, "I was playing the song. She knows which one. It was always hers." That's when the detective froze. Because at the crime scene, the stereo in the guest house was on. And the song? Mad World by Gary Jules. A song about isolation. About watching the world spin without you. A song often used in film scenes portraying mental collapse. And according to Romy's old Instagram post from 2021, it was our sibling's song growing up. Was it a message? A taunt? Or a cry for help? Here's where it turns from strange to unsettling. Police reviewed security footage from the home's private security system. There were no cameras inside the house itself, but there were 2 facing the front yard and 1 facing the guest house porch. At 3:44 a.m. on December 14th, that camera recorded movement. A figure walking, slowly, toward the main house. Dark hoodie, barefoot. The timestamp confirms. That was the hour the murders likely occurred. The figure disappears into the shadows for 23 minutes. At 4:07 a.m., he returns to the guest house. His hoodie is missing. He's holding something in his right hand. A kitchen towel? And that's it. No panic. No urgency. Just movement. Like a man brushing his teeth after a long day. When shown this footage, Nick reportedly nodded and said, "I didn't lie about that, did I?" Now here's the twist. Even though Nick confessed, he didn't enter a formal plea until days later. Why? Because in the hours after the interview, his attorney arrived. And everything stopped. Nick shut down. No more comments. No more cryptic remarks. Just silence. And that's when the media firestorm exploded. Rob Reiner's son arrested for double homicide. Nick Reiner confesses to killing parents in brutal stabbing. But the headlines didn't tell you what we're telling you now. That Nick's confession wasn't just about the act. It was about the why. And the why is still a mystery. Because when he stood before the judge to plead guilty, he didn't cry. He didn't shake. He didn't beg for leniency. He just said, "I accept what I've done." But you should ask what they did. Let's stop for a second. Have you ever known someone who blamed the world for everything wrong in their life? Have you ever seen pain become poison? Nick Reiner lived with 2 parents who, publicly, adored him, supported his film, gave him a home. But behind closed doors? Maybe that's where the real story was hiding. Because just before the judge finalized Nick's detainment, he added one last line, quietly, into the mic. The courtroom was silent. Only a few reporters caught it, but one recorded it. Nick said, "Check the safe." No one knew what he meant, not even the detectives, until they did. But what they found in that safe changed everything. And that's exactly what we'll uncover in the next chapter, because inside that safe was more than documents. It was a story, one the Reiner family never wanted told. What if the most dangerous place isn't the street, but the home everyone envies? That question lingered in the air as the courtroom emptied after Nick's quiet directive, "Check the safe." Reporters rushed for headlines. Analysts argued on cable news. Social media exploded with theories. But behind all the noise, one uncomfortable truth remained. This family was never as perfect as it looked. Hollywood royalty, yes, but royalty still bleeds. To understand what happened in that Brentwood house, you have to understand what the Reiner name meant and what it demanded. Rob Reiner wasn't just successful. He was institutional. A director whose films were stitched into American culture. A man whose dinner parties were attended by senators, actors, activists, and power brokers. At award shows, he was warm. On camera, charming. In interviews, a devoted father who spoke openly about loving his kids, especially Nick. The son who struggled, but tried. That phrase came up again and again. Struggled, but tried. It sounded compassionate, supportive. But for Nick, that phrase reportedly felt like a brand burned into his skin. Friends from Nick's teenage years would later say the pressure was unbearable. Imagine growing up where every adult comparison starts with, "Your dad made when Harry met Sally." Every dinner guest had an opinion. Every teacher expected genius. Every failure felt public. And when Nick didn't follow the golden path, when addiction crept in, when anger surfaced, when film school didn't magically fix everything, the disappointment was silent, but constant. Not screamed, just felt. Nick once allegedly told a friend, "They clap for him. They tolerate me." That word again, tolerate. The family tried to manage it the Hollywood way. Private therapists, closed-door rehab facilities, public silence. Never messy, never loud. Because in Hollywood, perception is everything. And the Reiners were masters of perception. Michelle Reiner, in particular, was known as the glue. Warm, elegant, protective. Friends described her as the one who smoothed things over after blow-ups. The one who called Nick daily during rehab. The one who convinced Rob to finance Nick's film project as a fresh start. But here's the contradiction no one wanted to face. Being protected isn't the same as being understood. And sometimes, protection feels like control. By the time Nick moved into the guest house, the family told people it was independence. A reset. Space to heal. But insiders say the rules were strict. No overnight guests. No parties. No access to the main house after 9 p.m. Mandatory therapy sessions. Drug testing. Was it care? Or surveillance? Nick reportedly felt watched. Managed. Monitored. And yet, he stayed. Why? Because leaving meant losing the last thread connecting him to the family identity that defined him. The Reiner name. The same name he loved. The same name he resented. Meanwhile, Romy watched it all from the sidelines. The youngest. The observer. She was artistic, sensitive, and deeply private. Friends say she often acted as an emotional translator between Nick and their parents, softening words, calming tempers, carrying messages. That role takes a toll, especially when you sense something is wrong, but can't quite name it. Romy once posted a now-deleted story that read, "Families don't break loudly. They crack quietly." At the time, no one noticed. After the murders, everyone did. And then there was Jake, the half-brother, the outsider insider. Jake didn't grow up under the same roof. He had distance, perspective, which made his occasional comments feel dangerous, unfiltered. According to someone close to the family, Jake once told Rob, "You can't produce your son's life like a movie. He's not a script." That conversation reportedly ended badly. Raised voices, doors slammed, silence for months. And Nick? Nick heard about it. He took it as proof that someone finally saw what he felt. Here's where the story turns darker. Because in the months leading up to the murders, there were signs, small, easy-to-dismiss signs, that something was slipping. A neighbor reported shouting late at night. A housekeeper allegedly quit abruptly. A longtime family friend stopped visiting altogether. When asked why, she supposedly said, "There was too much tension." It felt like something was waiting to happen. Waiting. Like a storm no one wanted to name. Rob Reiner once said in an interview, "Comedy comes from pain. But pain doesn't always become comedy. Sometimes it becomes silence. Sometimes resentment. Sometimes violence." And inside that beautiful house, the silence was growing louder. On the outside, the Reiners were celebrating. Awards, appearances, charity events. On the inside, communication had narrowed to logistics. Who's paying for what? Who's late to therapy? Who's disappointed? Love expressed as management. Affection delivered as instruction. Nick reportedly started writing obsessively during this time. Journals, notes, fragments, most of them never seen. Except one phrase, repeated over and over, according to a source who claimed to have glimpsed the pages. "They decide who I am." That belief, true or not, became Nick's reality. And realities, once believed deeply enough, don't need facts to survive. Here's the uncomfortable question we need to ask. Can you love someone and still crush them? Can good intentions still do damage? The Reiners believed they were helping. Nick believed he was being erased. And somewhere between those two truths, something snapped. When investigators later reviewed years of family emails and messages, a pattern emerged. Short replies, formal language, no warmth, even between parents and child. Except for Romy. Her messages were different, longer, emotional, apologetic. I'm trying. I know it's hard. Please don't give up. She was trying to hold the family together with words. But words have limits. And pressure doesn't disappear just because no one talks about it. It builds. Quietly. Relentlessly. By the time December arrived, the house wasn't just a home. It was a pressure chamber. And Nick? Nick felt cornered. Not physically, but emotionally. And when people feel trapped long enough, they don't always look for escape. Sometimes, they look for release. So when Nick told detectives, they made me, it wasn't just deflection. It was belief. A belief shaped by years of comparison, control, silence, and unresolved pain. Does that justify what happened? No. But it explains why the story isn't simple. Why this isn't just a headline about madness. It's a tragedy built slowly, brick by brick, behind a beautiful facade. Because what came next, what was inside that safe Nick mentioned, wasn't just paperwork. It was proof. Proof that this family had been fighting battles no one ever saw. And when investigators finally opened it, they realized this case was about to become much bigger than a single night of violence. Much bigger than a confession. Because the safe didn't just contain documents. It contained history. And once that history came out, everything changed. He scared me. He always scared me. That's what Rob Reiner allegedly told officers the day she found her parents' bodies. But what's more shocking? She didn't say it with panic. She said it with certainty. Not like someone reacting in the moment, but like someone who had been waiting to say it for a very long time. And that whisper, that quiet, devastating warning, might be the most important clue in the entire case. Because while the world had been focused on Nick's confession, few asked this. What did Romy know, and when did she know it? Let's go back to the beginning of that day. Not when she found the bodies, but a few hours before. Sources close to the investigation say Romy had been texting a friend around 7 a.m., talking about something strange she'd noticed the night before. Her message, now confirmed in the police affidavit, read, "I think he's up again. Lights are on in the guest house. I'm getting a bad feeling." The friend didn't respond immediately, and by the time they did, Romy had stopped replying. She was already in the car, driving to the house, headphones in, holiday decorations in the back seat, and dread in her chest. She had felt something. She didn't know what, but she felt it. Isn't that always how tragedy creeps in? Not with a scream, but a whisper. Here's where the story gets even more haunting. Romy wasn't just worried about Nick. She had been keeping notes. Private, unshared. A digital diary on her phone, protected by Face ID and an encrypted app designed for trauma victims. Investigators retrieved it after securing a warrant. Inside, weeks of journal entries. Short, raw, frantic, each entry more urgent than the last. Here's one, dated just 12 days before the murders. He watches the house at night. I saw him again. He said nothing, just stared. I don't think Mom sees it. I know Dad doesn't want to, but I'm scared. That wasn't paranoia. That was a plea, and no one heard it. Or maybe no one wanted to. Romy had been the family's emotional antenna for years. She picked up the frequencies no one else could hear. Even as a child, she reportedly tried to break tension by making jokes, diffusing arguments, translating Nick's rage into something their parents could understand. But as she got older, it got harder. Nick's moods became less predictable, more volatile. She once told a classmate in college, "He either doesn't talk to me for weeks or shows up outside my place like we're still best friends." It's scary. That classmate, unnamed in the police report, shared that quote after the murder. But no one had heard it before. At least, no one who could have done something. The night before the killings, Romy was scrolling Instagram when she received a DM from a burner account. The username was a random string of letters. No followers. No posts. The message simply read, "Don't come tomorrow. It's not safe." She took a screenshot, but she didn't take it seriously. In fact, she laughed. She replied with a, and blocked the user. It seemed like spam, or a stalker. But now, Investigators believe that message may have come from Nick himself, anonymously, in a final, warped attempt to both warn her and control her. Because he didn't want her there. He didn't want her to be part of it. And yet, she came anyway. Here's something few people know. Romy had once reported Nick to their parents. This wasn't public. It never made it to TMZ or Variety. But sources close to the Reiner family say that 2 years ago, Romy pulled Rob aside and said, "I don't feel safe when he's around. I think he's not okay." Rob's response? Complicated. He loved his son. He knew Nick was unstable. But he also believed in second chances, in redemption arcs, in love the child, not the behavior. So, according to insiders, he told Romy, "We're keeping him close. It's safer this way." That phrase echoed in Romy's diary the night after that conversation. Keeping him close isn't safe. It's a slow grenade. A slow grenade. That's the image she used. Powerful. Haunting. Foreshadowing. Because Nick didn't explode all at once. He simmered. For years. And no one defused him. Let's pause. Ask yourself, if you felt your sibling was dangerous, what would you do? Would you tell your parents? Would you call the police? Would you confront them? Romy did all of the above. But no one believed her fully. Or if they did, they didn't act. Because this wasn't some stranger lurking in an alley. This was Nick. Their son. Her brother. Their burden. Their shame. Their hope. All tangled into one unstable human being. And so, like many families with secrets, they chose denial. Because it's easier. Until it isn't. Here's what makes Romy's story even more tragic. She was preparing to leave. Not just the house. The country. According to travel records found on her laptop, Romy had booked a one-way flight to Europe, leaving 2 days after the murders. To Paris. She'd even written a goodbye letter to her parents. She never got to give it to them. But police found it in a folder on her desktop, titled Letters I Won't Send. The final paragraph read, "I love you both, but I can't carry this anymore. I can't pretend I'm not terrified every time he texts me late at night. I'm sorry I couldn't fix things. I'm sorry I couldn't fix him." Let that sink in. This was a woman planning her escape, not from violence, but from emotional captivity, from the weight of watching a family unravel, while no one else seemed to see it. Romy wasn't shocked that something happened. She was shocked that it took this long. After the bodies were found, Romy sat in the back of a police cruiser, wrapped in a blanket, hands shaking, eyes hollow. She wasn't crying. She was processing. And then she whispered, "He's not going to stop. You don't know him like I do." The officer asked what she meant. She said, "He thinks this is justice." Justice. That word has echoed ever since. Because for Nick, the confession wasn't about closure. It was a statement, a reckoning, a declaration that he had been the one wronged. And Romy? She was the only one who saw it coming, the only one who tried to stop it. But no one listened. And now, she's the only one left. But what Romy didn't know, what no one knew at that point, was what detectives were about to uncover in the family's private safe. Because the moment LAPD cracked that steel door open and found what was inside, everything changed. Inside that safe was the real story. And it was about to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Reiner family. What if the evidence isn't in blood, but in silence? That's exactly what detectives discovered the moment they opened the Reiner family's private safe. Because they weren't looking for this. They expected deeds, jewelry, maybe an old will. Instead, they found a black leather folder labeled Private, Dr. Levin. And beside it, a dusty, unmarked microcassette recorder. Old. Analog. Like something out of the 1990s. Inside the folder, 17 printed transcripts. All therapy sessions. All about Nick. But here's the thing. These weren't his therapy notes. These were sessions Rob and Michelle attended without him. Sessions where they talked about their son. And what they said was terrifying. Let's rewind the clock again. About 3 years before the murders. According to timeline markers in the transcripts, Rob and Michelle began attending private therapy sessions with Dr. Harris Levin, a renowned Beverly Hills psychiatrist known for working with celebrity families in crisis. They never publicized it. They never mentioned it to Romy. They certainly never told Nick. But the transcripts don't lie. In one early session, Michelle allegedly said, "I'm afraid of him." Not always. But sometimes, it's like something switches off in his eyes. Rob, in contrast, tried to rationalize. "He's hurting. He's not a monster. We just have to hold the line and not panic." But over the course of those 17 sessions, a shift happened. The tone turned darker. The concerns more specific. In transcript number 9, Michelle described an incident where she found a knife in Nick's nightstand. Not a kitchen knife. Not a tool. A combat knife. When she asked him about it, he shrugged and said, "Protection." When Rob confronted him, Nick reportedly snapped, "You don't get to talk about protection when you're the reason I need it." The therapist asked what that meant. Rob didn't answer. Michelle did. "He's rewriting history, making us the villains." I think he believes it. But perhaps the most chilling entry came in session number 14. Michelle's voice, according to the transcript, cracked with emotion as she said, "If anything happens to us, please tell someone we tried. Please tell someone we knew something was wrong." She wasn't being metaphorical. She meant it. And now, reading those words after the crime, they feel like a prophecy. Now let's talk about the recorder. That small, scratched-up tape deck found next to the folder. When detectives pressed play, they expected family messages, maybe some of Rob's old voice memos. But instead, they heard a fight. A real, raw, captured argument between Michelle and Nick. Date stamped, August 11th, 2024, just 4 months before the murders. It began with something mundane. Nick asking for access to one of the family's shared accounts. He wanted money. Michelle declined. The tone shifted quickly. He raised his voice. She tried to calm him down. Then this line. "Nick, on tape, you keep acting like I'm crazy. Maybe I'll show you what crazy actually is." A pause. Then her voice, trembling. "Michelle, don't say that, Nick. That's not you." His reply? "Nick, you don't know me. You just play mom." And then, silence. The tape cut off. No click. No resolution. Just silence. Like a curtain dropping before the final act. Police believe Michelle recorded the conversation without telling Nick. Maybe for legal protection. Maybe to show her therapist. Maybe because part of her knew something was coming. Here's a wild twist. That wasn't the only recording. Inside the same safe was a flash drive labeled Our 2023 Audio. On it, clips. Dozens of short voice memos. Some from Romy. Some from Rob. Some, unmistakably, from Nick himself. Some were mundane. Others weren't. In one chilling 45-second clip, Nick appears to be narrating into his phone. "They think I'm a child, but I've been the only adult here for years. I kept their secrets. I know what they did. I don't have to be quiet forever." Detectives flagged that clip as crucial because it suggests motive, not just emotional breakdown. Deliberate anger, premeditation, a sense of entitlement to vengeance. And here's where it all twists again. Because during the discovery of these recordings, LAPD reached out to Dr. Levin, the psychiatrist who treated Rob and Michelle. His reply? He was shocked they had saved those files. Why? Because he claimed he warned them to delete them. In fact, in an email recovered from Rob's old account, Dr. Levin wrote, "For legal protection, I advise you not to retain or record these materials. They could be used out of context or worse." But they didn't listen. And in the end, that may be the only reason the public is learning just how scared Rob and Michelle were. They left breadcrumbs. Not because they expected to die, but because they didn't know what else to do. So let's zoom out. We now have a confession from Nick. Security footage of him walking to the main house before the murders. Journal entries from Romy expressing fear. Multiple therapy transcripts warning of escalation. A recorded argument. A digital audio file where Nick references revenge. This isn't just circumstantial. This is a case built on warnings. Ignored once. Whispered once. Recorded once. And now, too late, heard by the world. But here's the twist no one saw coming. Inside the final transcript, session number 17, dated just 3 weeks before the murders, Michelle says something unexpected. "There's something we haven't told the kids. Something we can't. And if they ever found out, it would destroy everything." The therapist asked if it involved Nick. She replied, "Yes. Him most of all." But what was she talking about? What secret could have been so dangerous that even Michelle, the glue, was afraid of it? That question will take us straight into the next chapter. Because the recordings weren't the only thing found in that safe. There was a letter, sealed, unopened, addressed to be read only if something happens to us. And what was inside would change everything. What if the monster doesn't hide under the bed, but sleeps in the guest house? That's what investigators quietly asked themselves as they opened the final item found in the Reiner family's private safe. A sealed letter, simple, cream-colored envelope, hand-addressed in Michelle's neat cursive. To be read only if something happens to us. Inside, 3 pages, tightly written, no greeting, no closing, just a confession. Not about a crime, but about a secret. A family secret. One that directly involved Nick. One that, according to Michelle's own words, was buried too deep for too long. What was that secret? It wasn't an affair. It wasn't a financial lie. It wasn't even about Nick's addiction. It was about his identity, and the truth that was kept from him since the day he was born. Let's pause, because this is where the line between family drama and psychological horror blurs completely. According to the letter, which has since been authenticated by law enforcement, Michelle wrote, Nick doesn't know the truth about his biological father. He believes it's Rob. He's not. We agreed never to tell him. Rob raised him, loved him, protected him, but he was never his blood. Let that settle. For 32 years, Nick Reiner believed he was the biological son of Rob Reiner. And he wasn't. Suddenly, everything makes a different kind of sense. The identity struggle, the constant rage, the chronic sense of not belonging, the repeated phrase in his journal, they decide who I am. Nick had felt it, deep down, in his bones. He knew something was off. He wasn't just angry at being managed or tolerated. He was furious at being lied to. His entire life, his name, his narrative, was a script someone else wrote for him. And in the end, he rewrote it the only way he knew how. With blood. Let's dig deeper into who Nick Reiner really was. Not the criminal, not the addict, not the forgotten son, but the human being. Because understanding what he became requires knowing where he started. Nick's early life was marked by privilege and paradox. He grew up surrounded by fame. He was in rooms with icons before he could walk. Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, even political figures like Bill Clinton passed through his family's living room. But inside those walls, Nick wasn't a golden child. He was volatile. Prone to tantrums, deep depressive episodes, bursts of obsessive energy. By age 11, he was already showing signs of oppositional defiant disorder. At 13, he was caught drinking. At 15, he was suspended from school for violent behavior. But the family never went public. They managed it quietly. Because when your father is Rob Reiner and your grandfather is Carl Reiner, the last thing you want is headlines that read, Reiner's son in trouble. So they handled it behind closed doors. Tutors, therapists, programs, medications, everything but the truth. And then came Being Charlie. The film, his film, a semi-autobiographical story co-written by Nick, loosely based on his struggles with addiction. Rob directed it. It was meant to be healing, cathartic, closure. But behind the scenes, according to a former crew member, it was a disaster. Nick would vanish for hours. He'd scream at assistants. There were whispers he was using again. It was tense. After the film's limited release, Nick disappeared from public view. He resurfaced in the guest house. Quiet, withdrawn, but inwardly, seething. He began journaling obsessively. In the digital files recovered from his devices, investigators found hundreds of entries. Some philosophical, some violent, some almost poetic. Here's one, dated 6 months before the murders. They dressed me in someone else's life. Told me it was mine. I don't know who I am, but I know who I'm not. And that's enough. Another, just weeks later. What if breaking the illusion is the only way to be real? What if the lie is the real violence? These aren't the ramblings of a mind completely gone. They're structured, purposeful, and they all point to one central theme. Betrayal. Nick's therapist, court appointed after his arrest, would later describe him as having compensatory narcissism built around profound identity fragmentation. In simpler terms, he built a personality to survive. And when that personality cracked, so did he. The therapist's report continues. There is evidence of early childhood trauma, possibly attachment disorder, reinforced by perceived emotional neglect and lack of coherent identity. Subject feels manufactured and resents the authors of that identity. Resents. Let's linger on that. Nick didn't just feel abandoned. He felt manufactured, as if he had been invented, packaged, sold. The Reiner name was his costume. And underneath? He didn't know who he was. Now, combine that with what Michelle wrote in her letter. We feared the truth would break him. But now I wonder if the lie broke him first. That line chills to the core, because it suggests that everything, the therapy, the boundaries, the guest house exile, wasn't enough. Because the foundation itself was built on sand. Nick Reiner never knew where he came from. And when he finally felt it, when he sensed it wasn't what he'd been told, he imploded. So here's the most devastating contradiction in this story. Rob Reiner wasn't Nick's biological father, but by every account, he raised him with love. He produced his film. He defended him in public. He gave him a home. He tried. But sometimes, love isn't enough. Not when it's built on a secret. Not when the person receiving it doesn't believe it's real. When detectives read Michelle's letter, they knew they couldn't keep it quiet. They brought it to Romy. She read it in silence. Then reportedly whispered, "I knew. Not the details. Not the biological father. But something. Something had always felt off. And now? Now the final piece had fallen into place. But here's the twist. Nick still didn't know. As of the time of his guilty plea, no one had told him. He confessed. He took responsibility. But he never knew why he felt so out of place his entire life. Or maybe, some part of him did. Maybe that's why he said during his confession, "They weren't who you thought they were." He wasn't just talking about them. He was talking about himself. So where does that leave us? With a shattered legacy. A dead mother. A dead father. A son locked away. A daughter broken by trauma. And one truth still lingering like smoke in a burned-down house. If the lie hadn't been told, would the murders have happened? In the next chapter, we turn to the last person anyone expected to play a role in this saga, Jake Reiner. Because after the murders, he vanished for nearly a week. And when he came back, he wasn't alone. He brought evidence. And what he showed detectives changed the case forever. Why did Jake disappear? That's the question everyone, from LAPD to late-night pundits, asked in the hours following Nick Reiner's arrest. While Romy was giving statements and detectives were combing through therapy transcripts, Jake Reiner vanished. No texts, no calls, no posts, no signal. Not even Romy knew where he went. And when he finally returned, 6 days later, he walked into the LAPD precinct holding a flash drive and a journal. He didn't say a word at first. He just dropped the items on the desk, looked at the lead investigator, and said, "You're going to want to see this." What was on that drive? What did the journal reveal? More importantly, what was Jake doing during those 6 missing days? To understand that, you need to understand Jake Reiner, Nick's older half-brother. The son of Rob Reiner and his first wife, Penny Marshall. Yes, that Penny Marshall, director of Big, A League of Their Own, and television royalty in her own right. Jake grew up in a very different world. Different house, different energy, different expectations. He was quiet, private, respected, a journalist by trade, a former news anchor, a man who once described himself as the invisible son. In interviews, Jake rarely spoke about Nick. When asked, he offered brief answers, always vague, always filtered. But behind that media-trained smile, there was tension. And now, after the murders, that tension had boiled over. Jake arrived at the Brentwood estate just 2 hours after the news broke. He walked through the yellow tape, identified himself, and reportedly stood frozen on the lawn for a full minute. When detectives approached, he said one thing. "I told them. Years ago." No one listened. Then he left. No further comment. No forwarding address. He disappeared. Where did he go? Sources say Jake flew to New York that evening, booking a last-minute red-eye under a pseudonym. He stayed at a small hotel in Brooklyn. Used cash. No paper trail. Why? Because, according to what he later told detectives, he had to retrieve something. Something Rob gave him. Years ago. Something he had promised never to open, unless something terrible happened. That something turned out to be a small black moleskine journal with 2 initials on the cover. N.R. Nick Reiner. The journal contained entries handwritten by Rob Reiner himself. A kind of emotional ledger. A father's attempt to process raising a child who didn't know the full truth. Many of the entries were letters Rob never sent. Here's one, dated 2015. "You'll never understand why I lied to you, and I'll never be able to explain it. But I loved you the moment I saw you. Not because you were mine, but because you were real. So damn real it scared me." Another entry, 2017. "You call me a liar today. You're not wrong. But I lied because I was afraid that the truth would mean losing you." And another, 2020. "I should have told you. I should have said it out loud. You're not my blood, Nick. But you're still my son. And I'd die to protect you. Those words never made it to Nick. They were buried in that notebook, hidden in Jake's New York apartment, until the murders changed everything. But it wasn't just the journal that mattered. It was the flash drive. On it, a collection of voicemails, emails, and recorded Zoom sessions between Rob and Jake, spanning almost 5 years. Conversations about Nick. Concerns, fears, worries they never voiced publicly. In one video clip, Rob appears distressed. Pacing in his study. He's spiraling again, Jake. I don't know what to do. He's accusing us of things that never happened. It's like he's rewriting the story. Jake responds, You have to tell him the truth, Dad. He deserves to know. He's not 10 anymore. Rob shakes his head. It'll break him. You don't understand. He's not like you. He's fragile. In that moment, you see it. The choice. The line between honesty and protection. And Rob chose protection. But here's the contradiction. In trying to protect Nick from the truth, he may have created the very fracture that destroyed the family. And Jake? He watched it unfold from the sidelines. He warned them. He pleaded. He even cut off communication at one point, saying in one email, If you're not going to tell him, I can't be part of this anymore. It's not just a lie. It's psychological sabotage. Still, nothing changed. Until everything broke. So why did Jake come forward now? Why, after years of staying out of the spotlight, did he hand over evidence? The answer came quietly. In a one-on-one meeting with Romy, days after his return, Jake reportedly told her, I thought the truth would save us. Turns out, it was too late. He paused. But maybe it'll save you. Because Romy, now the last surviving child in the Reiner family, had inherited a burden neither Jake nor Nick ever wanted to carry. The truth. The real story. And in a cruel twist of fate, she was now the only one left to tell it. But even Jake hadn't revealed everything. Not yet. Because there was one final clip on the flash drive, timestamped just weeks before the murders. A voice memo from Nick to Jake. It hadn't been delivered. It was recorded, but never sent. And when Jake heard it, his hands reportedly shook. Because in that message, Nick said, I know what you told Dad. I know you wanted him to tell me. But you never did. So I will. I'll show them who I really am. Then, silence. Just breathing. Then, one final line. No more pretending. Jake sat with that message for hours before turning it over. Because it wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. A storm warning. A promise. And no one saw it in time. So where does that leave us? With the realization that this tragedy wasn't just about a crime. It was about a secret that rotted everything from the inside out. A lie that grew too large, too heavy, too dangerous, until one son exploded. And the other, Jake, was left to pick up the pieces. But the fallout wasn't over. Because just days after Jake's return, a new will surfaced. And when lawyers opened it, Nick's name was scratched out. What if the final motive wasn't rage, but inheritance? That's the chilling theory prosecutors began leaning into the moment a new will was found. One that Rob and Michelle Reiner had quietly updated just 3 months before their deaths. Until then, investigators were operating under the assumption that this case was about emotional implosion. A son overwhelmed by secrets. A family crippled by silence. A tragedy born out of psychological collapse. But what the updated will revealed shifted the focus from feelings to finances. Because in the last legally binding revision of their estate planning documents, dated September 2nd, 2025, one line stood out above all others. Nicholas Reiner shall receive no inheritance, monetary or otherwise, unless otherwise specified in a future revision, pending demonstration of rehabilitation and psychiatric stability. And underneath that clause, Nick's name had been physically scratched out, not deleted digitally, not amended by lawyers. Scratched, by hand, with a pen. As if someone couldn't bear to hit backspace, but needed to make a point. Let's put this in perspective. The Reiner estate, at the time of their deaths, was valued at approximately $56 million. This included the $13.5 million Brentwood estate, multiple investment accounts, royalties from Rob's extensive filmography, stocks in media companies, trusts established for Romy, Jake, and, previously, Nick. And now, Nick was out. Completely. That discovery restructured everything. Because now, there was a motive beyond emotional betrayal. Money. According to the Reiner's estate attorney, who spoke to LAPD after the document was authenticated, the amendment had been Rob's idea. Why? Because of an incident that took place in July of 2025. An incident never made public until now. Let's rewind. On July 18th, just 5 months before the murders, Rob and Michelle met privately with their attorney in downtown Los Angeles. They were shaken, tense. They had just had a major confrontation with Nick. He had allegedly threatened to sue them for emotional abuse, abandonment, and breach of fiduciary responsibility. That's right. Nick, the son who had been given housing, therapy, and financial support for years, now claimed they had violated his rights. He demanded access to his trust account. When Michelle hesitated, he reportedly exploded, screamed, paced, threw a glass against the wall, and said, "You owe me. You've been living off my pain for years." Rob was stunned. Michelle was terrified. That same night, they drafted a revision to the will, and 3 days later, they signed it. But they didn't file it publicly. They stored it in a fireproof safe inside Rob's home office, the same safe where the therapy transcripts and recordings were kept. They didn't want Nick to know. And now, it's clear why. Here's where it gets darker. Just days after that revision, Rob wrote an email to his financial advisor. The subject line? Nick, possible emergency clause. In the body of the message, Rob asked, "Can we legally protect the estate from being contested by a family member with diagnosed mental illness? Is there a way to preemptively sever claims?" The advisor never responded in writing. Instead, they called. That call is believed to have set in motion the creation of a legal firewall. One that would have made it almost impossible for Nick to access any portion of the Reiner fortune if the new will had been finalized in court. But it wasn't. It was signed. It was dated. But it was never filed. So legally, it's in limbo. And that's where the fight begins. Because once Nick's name was scratched out, Romy and Jake became the primary beneficiaries. And Nick? Nick became a legal threat, not just to their inheritance, but to the entire structure of the estate. And maybe, just maybe, that's what pushed him over the edge. Because here's what investigators discovered next. Nick had access to Rob's office. He knew the code to the safe. He knew where the documents were kept. And yet, the night of the murder, nothing was taken. No cash, no jewelry, no electronics. Only 2 things were missing. A copy of the original will, the one where Nick was still included. A sealed envelope addressed to Rob's estate attorney. Both were gone. The implication? Nick may have tried to erase the revision, to pretend it never existed, to restore his place in the Reiner dynasty. But there's more. On his laptop, police found a search history that included the following. Can you destroy a will if no one has seen it? What makes a will invalid in California? Can mental illness remove inheritance rights? What is undue influence in estate law? All searched within 2 weeks of the murders. Still think this was just a crime of passion? Or was it a calculated move, driven by fear, resentment, and a desperate grasp for legacy? Here's what one prosecutor told a closed briefing. Nick wasn't just angry. He was cornered. Emotionally, financially, legally. This wasn't just about lies or love. It was about power. About being written out of the only story he thought was his. That story, the Reiner name, the fame, the wealth, the legacy. And when that legacy was taken away, Nick may have decided if he couldn't have it. No one could. But here's the most twisted part. Even after all of this, after the new will, the scratched-out name, the threats, the explosion, Rob and Michelle still didn't tell him the truth. They still didn't say, "You're not Rob's biological son." They died with that secret. And in doing so, they may have unknowingly fueled the very paranoia that consumed Nick from the inside out. So what happens now? Well, the court is still deciding which version of the will stands. The estate attorney is pushing for the revised document. Nick's public defender is already hinting that the will could be a post-homicide forgery, a wild claim, but one that could muddy the waters just enough to delay proceedings. Meanwhile, Romy, she's silent. She hasn't commented on the will, but friends say she's furious. Not about the money, but about the fact that her parents saw it coming and still didn't stop it. Because just days before their deaths, according to a text recovered from Michelle's phone, she told a friend, "We're updating things. Just in case. Nick is unstable again. We're praying it's just a phase." It wasn't. And now, the question remains. Did Rob and Michelle try to protect their fortune while underestimating the real cost? Because what came next was the final dinner and the argument that blew the whole family sky high. Sometimes the Last Supper isn't symbolic, it's literal. And for the Reiner family, the dinner party held on November 22nd, 2025, just 3 weeks before the double homicide, wasn't just a family gathering. It was a ticking bomb. Guests thought they were attending a warm pre-holiday evening. Catered, intimate, elegant. Wine was poured, lights dimmed to golden hues. Michelle had her signature jazz playlist on loop. But behind every smile that night was a fuse. And before dessert had even been served, one guest would later recall, it felt like something cracked wide open. The guest list was small, just 8 people, including family. Rob and Michelle, Romy, Jake, 2 close family friends, names withheld, Michelle's sister, and Nick. This was unusual. Nick hadn't been invited to many family functions in recent months, not since the July confrontation about the will. But Michelle insisted he come. She told Jake, "It's the holidays. Maybe we can have one night where we all breathe." Jake reportedly resisted. Romy too. But Michelle pushed. She believed in forgiveness. She believed Nick needed family. So the table was set. The candles were lit. And the tension was unspoken but electric. At first, things were quiet. Rob toasted the group. Everyone clapped politely. Nick nodded but didn't raise his glass. He sat stiffly, wearing a black button-up shirt, sleeves rolled up. No jacket. No smile. He barely spoke for the first hour, until someone brought up Being Charlie, Nick's semi-autobiographical film. A friend complimented the screenplay, said it felt vulnerable and honest. Nick's response? A laugh. Not a friendly one. A sharp, bitter chuckle. Funny. That's what they said about the family, too. The room froze. Romy looked down. Jake looked away. Michelle tried to laugh it off. Oh, come on, Nick. That film was a gift. Nick didn't back down. No, it was a warning. And you all ignored it. From there, it spiraled. The argument escalated quickly. Jake tried to pivot the conversation. Romy begged Nick to lower his voice. But he was already gone. Already in that place. The emotional no man's land where only fury lives. He stood up, knocked his chair back, and unleashed what one guest described.